Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. Today's topic is PowerPivot for SharePoint. Just a little introduction before we get started for anyone who hasn't attended before. This is our 30 on Thursdays bi-weekly webinar series that we focus on everything SharePoint. Our next webinar will be locking down sensitive data in SharePoint, and it'll be taking place in 2 weeks from today. Our full schedule of our webinars is on sharepoint.protiviti.com/webinars if you're interested in signing up for any future 30 on Thursdays. Here's a list of our upcoming online training. If you're interested in anything from Nintex to power user courses to styling and branding, all these classes are online and are available to learn more at sharepoint.protiviti.com/training. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about BI, Anne will be teaching 2 upcoming webinars and a 2-day online course. We have Business Intelligence for SharePoint webinar on March 27th. It's a 3-hour online webinar. Anne will also be teaching our Business for Intelligence for SharePoint course. It's a 2-day online course on April 8th through the 9th from 9:30 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Again, you can learn more about these 2 courses at sharepoint.protiviti.com/training. So for today's session, it is being recorded. You can view all of our past sessions at sharepoint.protiviti.com/archived webinars. Please save all your questions until the end. You can insert them in the GoToMeeting window, and we will get to as many as we can at the very end. Today's topic is PowerPivot for SharePoint. Our presenter today is Anne Wallinger with Protiviti, and I am Julia Oates, and I will be moderating today's session. So let's get started.
All right. Hello, everyone. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time, and we do have a lot to cover, so I'm going to move pretty quickly. But as Julie stated, if you want to know more, you can simply come to that 3-hour webinar coming up in March or the 2-day class, and we're really going to get into more of the details of this. So we're going to talk about PowerPivot, which is basically it's the ability for you to build a cube in Microsoft Excel without knowing that you built a cube. So if you are in the BI world at all, the business intelligence world, then you've probably heard about slicing and dicing and these things that we call cubes, which are basically 3-dimensional models of our data. So you can do it in Microsoft Excel 2010. There's an add-in. If you Google it or Bing it, you'll be able to see that it's a free add-in for Excel. Starting with Excel 2013, it's actually included. You might need to enable your add-in, but it should be there. And let's go ahead and jump into the PowerPivot Gallery so you can see what kind of cool things this is going to give you. So for one, it looks nice. This is a Silverlight view of the PowerPivot Gallery, and it shows us all sorts of reports that we've created, and you can just kind of tick through them and see what's going on with your business every day by looking at these different charts that are automatically updated overnight. This is called the carousel view of the library. I'm going to jump over to a different view. I'll show you what the actual default gallery view looks like. So again, this is a Silverlight view, and it shows you all the different workbooks. These are Excel workbooks that I have. So think of the PowerPivot Gallery as a very stylish flavor of a document library in SharePoint. And we've got all sorts of different kinds of reports in this gallery. So how do you get started with PowerPivot? Well, you start in Excel. So I'm going to go ahead and open up a new window for Excel here. And this is just a blank workbook, and once your add-in is enabled, you'll see a tab in the ribbon called PowerPivot, and you click on Manage to go over and manage your PowerPivot connection. And since I'm starting from scratch, I don't see anything in my PowerPivot window, so I go ahead and I say I'd like to get some data from a database. I'm going to use SQL Server. We could connect this to basically anything with an OLADB or ODBC connection. And I'm going to point it at my local host. I've got a server on this database on this machine that I'm working on. And my database is called BI2. And I click Next, and now it's going to ask me, do I want to write a query to pull back the data I'm interested in analyzing, or do I want to select a list of tables and views to analyze? So I'm going to go with this first option, tables and views. And from here, I could select a table and say, get me the related tables, and it will analyze my foreign key relationships to figure out what other tables might be related. Or I could simply use the picker control and pick out the things that I know I'm interested in. I also see my views here, and in this case in my database I've got a lot of business logic tied up into my views, so I'm going to go ahead and use those instead of tables, and we're just going to pick a couple for example here. Maybe I'll have a date, area, region, state, membership, and organization. And when you're done picking out your data, you go ahead and say finish, and it's going to go ahead and pull this data right now from the SQL Server into the Excel workbook. And when you have the PowerPivot add-in installed, the limitation of rows, which is somewhere around 1 million in a regular Excel workbook, is lifted, so you can have millions and millions. I think it's actually like 2 billion is the upper limit right now for rows. So this is going to take just a minute or two. It's pulling an awful lot of data. This is the largest table. The membership table has actually got about 5 million rows of data, so we're just going to watch it tick here for a moment. And one of the downsides of using views is it's not going to automatically see my foreign key relationships. It only does that with tables, so I'm going to show you how to define those in case you need to do that yourself sometime. And that's pretty speedy considering that my dev box only has 8 gigs of RAM and it's running SharePoint and SQL and a million other tools. So it's really pretty good performance. And now we're done. And we close this window and we'll see it's going to populate one tab per table that I imported. So this was my date table. This was my very small region table. If I switch over, the largest one is the membership table. I can change to this diagram view, and that gives me kind of a better big picture of all the data that I just pulled in. So I can kind of resize these things and move them around. Now, again, if I'd used tables, it would know the relationships between all the data that I pulled in because of the foreign keys. But since I used views, it doesn't. But it's really easy to define that. So I know that my membership table has a snapshot every month of what my membership numbers look like. So this date relates to this date. So I'm just going to drag it and drop it. And then same kind of idea with, I'm missing a table. There must be one. There's one hiding over here. Let me grab that guy. Move him over. My membership relates to an organization. And then my organization relates up to a state. And state relates to area. So again, I'm just dragging and dropping to create these relationships in my data. And then area relates to region. So that's not the prettiest picture, but you get the idea. The next thing you'd really want to do, because you are building a cube, whether you know it or not, is make this a little bit more user-friendly. So for example, the names of my views, vDate, that's not all that familiar. I might want to just call it date or call it timeline or something else. So you can just double click on all these things to give them better names. You might also decide that you want to have a hierarchy. So I can use this little button that says create a hierarchy. And we'll call this, I don't know what we'll call it, but we're going to call it time. And I want the user to be able to drill down. In this case, we would start at the year level. And then we go down to quarter. And then I have the month number in here because if you just use the month name, it sorts it alphabetically, and that's not very friendly. So I use month number and then month name. So that would be my hierarchy. It looks like I missed that one. There we go. And you can also hide things. So like the region ID is just a random number that doesn't mean anything. So I would right-click on that and hide it from the tools, maybe even the region description. I don't want users to see that building their reports. So you really want to invest some time into building this out as what you can think of as your data model or again your cube. And when you're done doing that, you can click on this little button to go back to the Excel window and go over to data and existing connections, and it knows that that data is in this workbook. And we say open that existing connection. I'm going to go with the default to put it in a PowerPivot table report. And now this is that model that I just created. So you can see some things are still kind of ugly because I didn't take much time to clean it up, but there my date was renamed. I have my time hierarchy, year, quarter, month. So let's go ahead and click on a couple of these things. over in my membership table, I have things, again, like new flag. So here's an example that I didn't give it a very good name, and it doesn't have enough comma in it, so it's hard to read. So I might want to go back to my PowerPivot window many times while you're doing this exercise. And instead of new flag, let's you can double click it or right click rename and call it new members would be better. And then also back in your data view, remember this was the diagram view, you'll want to take a few minutes to format these. So I know it needs a comma, so I want to tell it to have a comma. Get rid of those decimal places. I know I don't need those. And then when you go back to your Excel window, it removed my measure because I renamed it, and I don't have one called new flag anymore, but now I see new members there. And it has a comma. So again, invest some time and you'll get that looking good. We could add a chart real quick. Let's just do a bar chart. The default is fine. And whenever you're ready building out this report, the next step would be to go ahead and save it. And we would want to save it up to SharePoint into that nice gallery we have, the PowerPivot Gallery. I'm going to call it Thursday. It's asking me what my content type is because it's SharePoint and we have content type, so I just go with the default. You can see down here in the status bar it says it's saving it, and now it's uploading it. And this is a pretty big workbook, remember, because it has embedded in it this cube now and 5 million rows of data. But what that's going to do, let me jump back over here to the SharePoint window and refresh it. It might take it a moment to show up. So this one at the top is I created in exactly the same way. I don't see our new one there quite yet. There it is down at the bottom. It's working on it, and it has this hourglass, which tells me that it hasn't finished generating the thumbnail, which is this cute little image of the file yet. So it takes it a moment or two to do that. But once you're done, it's in here for everyone to look at, and you can click on it to view it in Excel services. You can build it out a little bit more than I did in that quick example. This one's a little nicer. I have some slicers that I put in Excel so I can change the year. You see my chart and my grid are updating when I do that. I have a second tab in the same workbook. This one has a timeline slider that I use. Those are new in Excel 2013. So if I was only interested in the second half of the year, I guess July is the second half of the year, I could use my slider, and again you see the charts and graphs updating. I could zoom in on just the South Central region. Let's go back to our PowerPivot view. See if our new one's there yet. And there it is down at the bottom. Not a very pretty one, but you get the idea. And again, it's exactly the same data set that was used to create this one at the top where I had a little bit more time. So now there's a couple other things we can do with this. One is that I've got all that data. I have the cube in this, and I actually named this data model on purpose so that I remember this particular workbook has the cube in it. If I just want to add some new reports using that same cube, I can use this button, Open New Excel Workbook from this data model, and we'll go ahead and say OK when prompted. And what that's going to do, I need to enable my data source as a security mechanism here, but what that's going to do is actually just have a pointer to the other workbook. So I can share my really big heavy-duty model in SharePoint. Nobody has to have it on their desktop, but my report writers can go ahead and have a pointer to it and create their own workbooks. So you'll see this is going to pop up with just that empty pivot table interface again, where I could go and start building more charts. And this one's cleaned up a little bit more. I took more time to rename everything. So I have my cancellations, my new members, my renewals. I added in a hierarchy for not only the time, but also, what did I call it? There it is, location. So if I wanted to see it by Northeast and drill down to the territory and drill down to the state, try to pull all those tables together. And when you do that and save it back to SharePoint, instead of seeing these three buttons like we do on the data model, you'll just see a spreadsheet like this one. So it's there, but it doesn't have any buttons associated with it because it itself does not contain the data model. I can still go ahead and open it in the browser in Excel services. I can still interact with it just like it had the cube in it. It's just that it's actually pointing to the cube instead of having a cube in it. And again, it's got a couple of tabs. I put a KPI in here that you can do that through PowerPivot as well Takes a little bit longer, so we might do that in our webinar in March, and all these different slicers to play with. So now let's back up to the second button. That was our first Excel, was new Excel from here. And I'm going to close a couple of things out because it tends to eat a lot of memory on my computer. So I'm going to try to. And the second button is create a Power View report. So this is a new tool that came with Reporting Services 2012. Again, you can use it with SharePoint 2010 or SharePoint 2013. And this one is really kind of presentation oriented. So if I just look at this, again, it's popped up, a little different interface than the pivot table in Excel, but here's all my data that I'd actually pulled into that PowerPivot cube. So I can look, let's go ahead and look at our current members, our cancellations, and our new members. And let's go ahead and look at that by region. That's an important piece of my data. And I'm going to change the display to maybe a card and see what that looks like. Make it a little bit bigger so I can see all my regions. And then I'll click somewhere else so I can add a new one of these sort of widgets. And we might want to look at all those people that left us, the cancellations. What do we think their risk level was? So we have them profiled in the database. And that would probably be a good candidate for a pie chart. And it needs to be a little bit bigger. So this tool, as you can see, is all very easy drag and drop. It's a little hard to catch the things to move them around, I think. There it is. But it's a great, easy to use tool. So we'll put that down there. Probably need to move this up a little bit. And maybe we'll do another for all the people who are with us, all of our members. So that would be just current members. I want to know what's their salary range. That's a good one. And let's do that one as a bar chart. And we'll make it a little bit bigger. And then we'll do one more. Let's look at, again, we're always interested in our current members, but I want to see, like, where do these people really live? So I'm going to do state and make it a little bit bigger and hit the map button. And this is truly amazing. It used to be so hard to build these things. Bing just did it for us. So now I can see the biggest bubbles over Texas. That looks like that's North Carolina, Florida. That's where most of my members are. So all of a sudden, very quickly, we built this great dashboard. The next thing I might want to do is just click Save, and you save it down to the PowerPivot Gallery, but that does take a few minutes, and I already have several examples, so I'm just going to cancel it in the interest of time and show you one of the ones that I already did. So like this one looks very much like what we did a moment ago. Again, you can see they can have multiple views in them. I call them views in Power View, just like we had multiple sheets in the Excel workbooks. When you come back in and open these, this is what it looks like, and you can go to full screen mode, get rid of all the toolbars and everything. You can edit it if you want to make changes to it. It is updating itself from the cube every time you open it to get the most recent data. You can actually interact with this thing too. I didn't add the slicers, but there's a little widget called a slicer. So if I only wanted to look at the government members, I could click on government and see that all the other web parts are going to filter. They're not really web parts, I guess widgets are going to filter out. So now we're only looking at government data. Or I could clear that. Maybe I want to know, what percentage of government are things, sort of. So if I look at this really long bar in the salary, I can see a lot of people in the 50 to 75K range, and I'm just kind of curious how many of those are government. So down here on my pie, where I had it sliced by government, I can click on the government piece of the pie, and instead of filtering, everything just kind of goes dim. So that tells me right up here to about this 25K mark is government, and everything else after that is non-government. It's one of these other two pieces of the pie. So a lot of really cool interactivity with Power View. Also, you don't want to miss the feature to export to PowerPoint. And again, I've already done that because it does take a moment to export it. I've got it here on my desktop. And when you do that and you go into presentation mode, as long as you can connect to the internet, you can connect to the website where your data lives, then no matter where you are giving this presentation, you're going to see this interact button, and we can go ahead and click that. And remember now, I've left the internet site. I am strictly in PowerPoint at this time, but with a live internet connection so that I can get to my site. Then the same way that we saw that data be interactive in PowerView, we're going to see it be interactive in PowerPoint here in a moment. There it goes. So again, much the same. It's going to refresh because it knows the data might have changed, doesn't know last time I opened PowerPivot, and I can again use these slicers in exactly the same way that you saw before. So that's very cool to be able to do that from a presentation. Go ahead and close that. I have just a couple minutes left to show you one last thing. If you've ever been anxious to use Performance Point, but then you find, oh, I can't because I don't have a cube and nobody has a cube, but that's hard to build them in analysis services. Well, now you have a cube. You built it in PowerPivot, so now you can use Performance Point as well. So I've got a little dashboard out here just to show you where I connected Performance Point web parts to my PowerPivot cube. I have a little bit of a I have a filter here, so I can look at either this year or last year or the last 2 years. So this is just 3 different actual web parts added to a SharePoint page. I have the scorecard web part over here with KPIs, that's key performance indicators. So I can look and kind of drill down to see in the Northeast what was my net gain, and it shows me in the New England region, it looks like my target was, I forget how to read this. Looks like my actual is 13.57%. My target was 8, so I'm well in the green, doing very well. As you click on these different regions of the scorecard, you'll see the chart is also updating over there. And the chart's highly interactive itself, so there's a lot of things we could do here, but I could change it to a stacked bar chart, for example. I could change it to a grid if I wanted to look at the numbers instead of the pictures, but that's not very fun. I could add measures to it because, again, remember it is connected to that PowerPivot worksheet that I created. So maybe we want to see those current members and go back to see it in the bar chart. And you can answer questions about your data. So if I want to know all these people who canceled in the general category, it's 27K of them, I'm going to go ahead and right-click on that and open the decomposition tree. And that's going to show me, again, just a different way to drill down into your data. I have 27,000 people in the general category who left. I want to know where they lived when they left, so I'll look at the region they live in. A lot of them in North Central. I can drill down and see in the bluegrass regions. A bunch of them in Kentucky. Figure out what risk level they were. So as you can see, you can just kind of go on and on. Any of the data that you brought into your PowerPivot, you're able to explore here. What salary range were they on? So things looks like we have exactly 6 minutes left for questions. That was a lot of information to take in. I hope I see you in one of my upcoming webinars or classes. There's no questions showing at this time, so if you do have a question, you can go ahead. Looks like we just got a couple coming through, and put them in the queue in your GoToWebinar. So one of the questions is, can the data source be a SharePoint list? Yes, it can, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. So for the data source for Performance Point, it can be a list, but you won't get that drill down functionalities you're seeing. You have to be connected to a cube for that. Can the data source for the PowerPivot be a list? Yes. It is more complicated than just the dragging and dropping and pointing and clicking. It's still that, but there's a lot more connections to be made. They've actually published, Microsoft has published a white paper. So if you do an internet search for Performance Point, SharePoint data source, I'm sorry, there's so many P's, PowerPivot, SharePoint list data source, you should come across that white paper, and it will show you everything you know to be able to hook that up. Can PowerPivot 2013 work with SharePoint 2010? I would recommend instead that you use PowerPivot 2010 with SharePoint 2010 because I've come across some just kind of buggy behavior. It does work, but it just seems like there's a bunch of things you run into that are problematic. So, and actually PowerPivot isn't exactly 2013. PowerPivot is part of SQL Server, so you're really looking at using SQL Server 2012, but I do recommend that you try to match up your Excel 2010 with SharePoint 2010 or Excel 2013 with SharePoint 2013 for the smoothest implementation. As far as if this will be recorded, yes, it will be, and everyone who registered will be notified at some point about the recording. The PowerPivot Cube will refresh as much, sort of up to once a day. So if we actually were to look back here real quick in the PowerPivot Gallery, you have control of that. One of the buttons in the PowerPivot Gallery that I skipped because of time was actually managing that refresh schedule. But so that's something whenever you add your data model, then you would go in and hit the calendar button, which I need to find. This last one looks like a little calendar. And that's where you actually set up your refresh. So if you go into configure schedule, I had this one set up to do it monthly, but you could do it as much as daily. If you need to do it more than daily, then you have to write some PowerShell scripts to get it to do that. For Office 2010 or 2013, either one will work. Is there any gain by using analysis services? Analysis services does still have a little bit more functionality than regular PowerPivot. PowerPivot is a version of analysis services, so you'll see especially with the 2012 install, when you put the SQL CD in and you install analysis services, it asks you, do you want a tabular model or do you want an OLAP model? So it's basically saying, do you want PowerPivot or do you want the old original analysis services? I think that in particular the functions, the MDX is more powerful, but they're really coming up to speed pretty quickly on the formula language called DAX that they use for PowerPivot. So I assume that at some point then you may be correct, you won't need analysis services anymore. There was mentioned that there's an archive of webinars, and yes, that is true. If you go to sharepoint.protiviti.com/archived webinars, all one word, you will find them there. Can PowerPivot work with SharePoint Online? They have just released a version called Power BI for the cloud. I mean, just as in the last couple of months, so I don't know all of the details yet, but the short answer is yes, they have just come up with that technology. And I think that was the last question, and it was also the last minute. So thank you everyone for coming today, and we will look forward to seeing you at our next one in 2 weeks.